Most Americans know Memphis as the birthplace of rock and roll, the home of the blues, the cradle of soul, the city of Elvis, of Otis Redding, of B.B. King. But behind that gilded image stands a darker truth. By 2024, the city that gave America its sound carried the highest violent crime rate of any place in the United States. The buildings that produced Memphis blues were demolished, and the motel where Martin Luther King Jr. died was nearly torn down. The story of how a music capital became a murder capital begins and ends with the buildings America chose to lose. Chapter 1: The Fortune Yellow, Fever Left Behind. In the autumn of 1878, 5,100 Memphians were buried in mass graves, and one black man bought every Beale Street parcel no one else wanted. His name was Robert Reed Church Sr. He had been born into slavery in 1839 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. His father was a white steamboat captain. His mother was an enslaved seamstress. He grew up working on the rivers and arrived in Memphis as a young man with no schooling and a quiet, watchful manner that strangers often mistook for shyness. It was not shyness, it was calculation. In May of 1866, when Memphis erupted in 3 days of racial violence, later known as the Memphis Race Massacre, Church was shot in the head and left for dead. He survived, he buried the bullet, he stayed in the city. 12 years later, when yellow fever swept up from the Gulf Coast and turned Memphis into a charnel house, he stayed again. The state of Tennessee revoked the city's charter. The mayor fled. Tens of thousands of residents who could afford to leave did so. Property values along Beale Street collapsed. Church bought. The early purchases were small, a 2-story brick storefront on the south side of the street, a vacant lot at the corner of Hernando, a wood-frame saloon, then larger, a theater, a row of boarding houses. By 1899, he had assembled enough holdings to fund Robert Church Park, a public auditorium at the east end of Beale Street, with seating for 2,000. He charged 10 cents admission. Booker T. Washington spoke there. Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke there. It was the only large auditorium in the United States owned and operated by a black man for black audiences. When Church died in 1912, his documented net worth fell somewhere between $700,000 and $1 million. In an era when the average annual wage was around $500, his estate represented the equivalent of 1,400 lifetimes of ordinary labor. He was, by every measure historians have applied since, the first black millionaire of the American South. His real legacy was not the money, it was the street. By the turn of the 20th century, Beale Street ran 24 hours a day. Saloons on the ground floor, brothels and gambling parlors on the upper floors, theaters in between, Italianate facades with cast iron columns, 2- and 3-story brick blocks with arched windows, the Old Daisy Theater, the Palace Theater, the New Daisy Theater, Pee Wee's Saloon at 127 Beale, where the cigar counter became a working desk for a young bandleader named William Christopher Handy. Handy had arrived in Memphis in 1905. In 1909, he wrote a campaign tune for the political boss Edward Hull, Crump called Mr. Crump. He rewrote it in 1912 with new lyrics and renamed it Memphis Blues. It was the first published blues composition in American history. In 1916, he followed it with Beale Street Blues, a song whose first line, "I would rather be there than any place I know," became the marketing slogan of the entire district. Memphis at that moment had what almost no other southern city had: a black commercial district with its own real estate, its own political organization, its own newspapers, and its own music. The buildings on Beale were not borrowed from white landlords. They had been bought by black hands from the estates of yellow fever victims, with money earned in the dirty industries no one else would touch. The fortune that built Beale Street came out of the worst public health disaster in the city's history. The buildings that fortune created would, within 60 years, be loaded onto demolition trucks and hauled away. But that was a story for later. In 1920, walking east from Main Street toward the river, you could hear pianos through the saloon doors and horns from the second-story windows. The music had begun, the buildings had been bought, the city did not yet know what it was holding. Chapter 2: The Sound. White Memphis refused to record. In 1950, a radio engineer named Sam Phillips rented a single storefront on Union Avenue because no major label in America would record the artists he wanted to hear. The building was a small single-story brick shop at 706 Union, originally constructed around 1916 as a radiator repair business. Phillips painted the front, hung a sign that read Memphis Recording Service, and built the studio himself. The control booth measured roughly 9 feet by 12 feet. The live room measured roughly 18 feet by 30 feet. He installed acoustic tile on the ceiling. He bought a single Presto disc cutter. The total capital investment was a few $1,000s. Phillips was 27 years old. He had been born in Florence, Alabama in 1923, the son of a tenant farm family. He had worked at radio station WLA in Alabama and then at WREC in Memphis, where he ran the Skyway broadcast from the rooftop of the Peabody Hotel. He had heard the music coming up Beale Street on his nights off. He had been told by every executive he asked that the major labels would not record those artists. So he opened his own studio. The first records he cut were on black artists almost no major label would touch. Howlin' Wolf, born Chester Burnett in Mississippi, recorded How Many More Years there in 1951. B.B. King recorded She Done Sold It in the same months. Ike Turner brought a band up from Clarksdale and recorded Rocket 88 under the name Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats. The session, in March of 1951, would later be cited by most American music historians as the first rock and roll record. The studio became, in the language of music journalism, a kind of crossroads. Black musicians walked in the front door. White musicians walked in the front door. Phillips ran the board for both. He was not a romantic man. He was a businessman who believed that the rural sound he had grown up around, the country music and the blues, were closer in feeling than the rest of the country was willing to admit. He believed that if a white singer could ever be found who sang with what he called a black feel, that singer would change American music. In July of 1954, a 19-year-old truck driver named Elvis Presley walked through the door. He had paid for a self-financed acetate the previous year as a birthday gift for his mother. Phillips had a country song he was trying to find an artist for. He invited Elvis back. The recording session that followed produced the song That's All Right Mama, an old Arthur Crudup blues record reworked at almost twice the original tempo. The single went out to local radio. Within a week, it was in regional rotation. Within a year, Elvis had 4 singles on the Sun label. The studio was now operating at full capacity. Johnny Cash walked in. Jerry Lee Lewis walked in. Carl Perkins walked in. Roy Orbison walked in. In one famous afternoon in December 1956, the 4 of them happened to be in the studio at the same time, sat down around a piano, and recorded what would later be released as the $1 Million Quartet Session. The reason all 4 of them were there was simple. Sam Phillips had built the only studio in the South that would record their kind of music. In November of 1955, RCA Records offered Phillips $35,000 for the contract of Elvis Presley. Phillips needed the cash to fund his next round of acts. He sold the contract. It was the most consequential $35,000 transaction in American music history. RCA went on to build a national star around Elvis. Sun Records remained a regional label. Phillips kept the studio, kept his other artists, and would later say that he did not regret the sale because the money funded the careers of Cash and Lewis and Perkins. He always said it a little too quickly. The original Sun building at 706, Union remained in use as a recording studio until 1959, when Phillips moved to a larger location. The building stood empty through the 1960s, the 70s, the early 80s. It was used as a barber shop. It was used as a diving school. The acoustic tile that Phillips had installed in 1950 was still on the ceiling. In 1987, an entrepreneur named Gary Hardy bought the building and reopened it as Sun Studio. In 2003, the day before Sam Phillips died, the studio was designated a National Historic Landmark. It was one of the few buildings in this story that survived. There would not be many. Chapter 3. The Hotel That Ran the South. The Italian Renaissance Revival Tower at Union and 2nd Street was not just a hotel, it was the social parliament of the Mid-South. The current Peabody Hotel opened in September 1925. It was the second hotel of that name. the first Peabody, opened in 1869 and named for the philanthropist George Peabody, had stood at Main and Monroe. By the 1920s, it was outdated, and a syndicate of Memphis cotton money commissioned the architect Walter W. Allschlager of Chicago to design a replacement. Allschlager produced a 12-story tower clad in light brick with carved limestone trim and a copper roof, 16 feet thick in places. The construction cost ran to approximately $5 million, an enormous sum for any Southern project in 1925. It opened with 625 rooms. The lobby was centered on a travertine fountain carved from a single block of Italian stone, weighing several tons, originally bought from a Florentine palazzo. The Skyway Ballroom on the top floor was added in 1937 and would host a live national radio broadcast from a band called the Peabody Orchestra every weeknight on WREC. The signal carried as far as Chicago, St. Louis, and New Orleans. The Peabody was not merely the largest hotel in Memphis. It was the political nerve center of the entire Mid-South. Cotton brokers traded contracts in the lobby. Tennessee politicians announced campaigns at the Skyway. The Cotton Carnival, founded in 1931 as a Mardi Gras-style civic festival, crowned its king and queen at the Peabody each year. The historian David Cohn wrote in 1935 that the Mississippi Delta began in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel and ended on Catfish Row in Vicksburg. He meant it literally. If you wanted to do business in cotton, in hardwood, in cottonseed oil, in river shipping, you walked into the lobby of the Peabody. The most famous feature of the hotel was a piece of theater. In 1933, the hotel's general manager, Frank Schutt, returned from a hunting trip with 3 live mallard ducks and put them in the lobby fountain as a prank. The ducks were a hit. Within 5 years, the practice had been formalized. 5 ducks descended every morning at 11 from the rooftop palace, walked along a red carpet to the fountain, swam in the fountain through the day, and walked back to the elevator at 5 in the afternoon. They have done it daily since. Behind the public theater stood a hidden infrastructure. At peak operation in the 1920s and 1930s, the hotel employed roughly 600 staff. Almost all of the housekeeping, cooking, bellhop, porter, and laundry positions were filled by black workers from the segregated neighborhoods of South Memphis, North Memphis, and Orange Mound. They walked to work in the dark, entered through service doors at the rear of the building, and left after the dinner shift had been cleaned and reset. Their wages ran roughly between 50 cents and $1 an hour. The basement of the hotel contained a tunnel network for coal delivery, ice delivery, and laundry transport. The Skyway Band's musicians slept in unmarked rooms on the lower floors. The building was, in its operation, a small city. Beale Street ran 4 blocks south of the Peabody. The Daisy Theater, the Palace, Pee-wee's, a Schwab Dry Goods, the Lansky Brothers clothing store, where Elvis bought his first pink suits, all of them were a short walk from the lobby fountain. The Cotton Exchange Building, where spot prices for the world's cotton market were set every morning, was 3 blocks west. The Memphis Cotton Carnival processions ran from the riverfront up Main Street to the Peabody Steps. For the city itself, those years were the absolute peak. Memphis at the height of the 1920s handled roughly 40% of the United States cotton crop. It was the largest inland cotton port on earth. Its sawmills processed roughly 1 billion board feet of hardwood per year, the largest hardwood market in the world. The Mississippi River shipping trade still ran through the city. The Cotton Exchange floor was busier than any other inland exchange in the world. National acts including Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith played the Palace and Daisy theaters on Beale Street, while white society danced on the Peabody Skyway 4 blocks north. A 1927 travel writer described Memphis as the New Orleans of the Upper River. The phrase stuck for a generation. The cotton money, the river commerce, the hardwood empire, and the music scene were running at the same time in the same downtown grid, each within a 15-minute walk of the others. For a few decades, the buildings of Memphis carried more cultural weight per acre than anywhere else in the American South. The Peabody, the Cotton Exchange, the Daisy, Pee-wee's, Church Park, the Lansky Brothers, the Lorraine Motel, 2 blocks south of Beale, where the black artists who recorded for Sun and Stax stayed when they were in town. It was the peak. The building stood. The music played. The lobby fountain was full of ducks. The Cotton Carnival crowned a queen. The Skyway broadcast carried Duke Ellington's orchestra to St. Louis. No one in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel in the autumn of 1927 knew that within 40 years, most of the buildings within their view would be on a federal demolition list. Chapter 4. The Band. The South could not forgive. Inside a converted movie theater on McLemore Avenue, two siblings hired a half-black, half-white house band in a city where that was illegal in most restaurants. The siblings were Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton. He was a banker by day, a country fiddler by night. She was a school teacher who had pawned her house to lend him the money for a tape recorder. They had founded a small label they called Satellite Records in 1957 in a garage in Brunswick, Tennessee. In 1959, they moved the operation into a former neighborhood movie theater at 926 East McLemore Avenue, in a working-class South Memphis neighborhood that was rapidly becoming majority black. The building had been the Capitol Theater, an early 20th century single-screen cinema. It had a sloping floor that ran from the back of the house down to the former screen. When the engineers measured the space, they realized the slope would create a strange standing wave problem with low-end frequencies. Stewart left it alone. He kept the slope. He installed a small control booth at the back, a tape machine, and a single set of microphones. The studio floor became the old movie audience. The control room sat where the projection booth had been. In 1961, the label was renamed Stax, combining the first letters of Stewart and Axton. The first hits came almost by accident. A black instrumental group called the Marquis recorded a track called Last Night that became a regional hit. A young keyboard player named Booker T. Jones, working as a teenager at Estelle's record shop in the front of the building, sat down at the studio piano during a break in another session and improvised a tune the engineers ran a tape on. The track was called Green Onions. It was released in 1962. It charted in the Billboard Top 5. The band that played it, Booker T. Jones on keyboard, Steve Cropper on guitar, Louis Steinberg, later replaced by Donald Duck Dunn, on bass, and Al Jackson Jr. on drums, became the house band of Stax Records. That band was half black and half white. In 1962, Memphis and the city of segregated water fountains, segregated buses until the year before, segregated lunch counters, segregated bowling alleys, segregated swimming pools. A half-black, half-white band could not legally eat together in most restaurants. Inside the studio at 926, East McLemore, they could play, eat, smoke, argue, and record. Outside the studio, they could not. Estelle ran the record shop out front, called Satellite Record Shop. Children from the neighborhood, mostly black children from the South Memphis projects, came in to listen to the latest singles on the in-shop turntable. Estelle treated them as customers. Many of those children, including Booker T. Jones, the soul singer William Bell, and the songwriter David Porter, ended up working at the label as musicians, songwriters, or back-office staff. The label was, in its day-to-day operation, racially integrated in a way that had no parallel in the American South. The artists came one after another. Otis Redding, brought up by his manager Phil Walden from Macon, Georgia. Sam Moore and Dave Prater, the duo Sam and Dave. The marquee saxophone players Wayne Jackson and Andrew Love, who became the Memphis Horns. Eddie Floyd, who walked in and wrote Knock on Wood in a hotel room down the street. Carla Thomas, Rufus Thomas, William Bell, the young songwriter Isaac Hayes, who would later record Hot Buttered Soul. By the mid-1960s, the building at 926 East McLemore was the most productive recording studio in the American South. The Stax distribution deal with Atlantic Records, signed in 1961, had pushed the label's records into national rotation. Sam and Dave's Hold On I'm Coming reached the Billboard Top 10 in 1966. Soul Man followed in 1967. Otis Redding's Try, A Little Tenderness, recorded the same year, became one of the defining records of the decade. In March and April of 1967, Stax sent a touring review to Europe under the name The Stax Volt Tour. The lineup included Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Eddie Floyd, Carla Thomas, Booker T, and the MGs, and the Marquis Horn section. They played 9 European cities. The audiences were, to a city, hysterical. London critics described the performances as the most important American musical export of the decade. The young members of an English band called the Rolling Stones reportedly canceled their own studio sessions to attend. The Stax sound had now passed Beale Street, past the Mississippi, past the Atlantic Ocean, and entered the global musical bloodstream. It came from a former movie theater in South Memphis, where a half-black, half-white band recorded inside a building that the surrounding city would not have allowed them to share in any other context. The peak moment of Stax in 1967 was, in retrospect, the highest moment of music made in the city of Memphis. The label had assembled, inside one converted theater, a creative collective that the segregated South should not have produced. It would not survive another year intact. On the 10th of December, 1967, the small twin-engine plane carrying Otis Redding and most of his backing band, the Bar-Kays, went down in a fog-covered lake near Madison, Wisconsin. Redding was 26 years old. He had recorded sitting on the dock of the bay 3 days before. The Stax studio at 926 East McLemore would never sound the same again. Chapter 5. The bulldozers arrive before the mourners. In June 1965, the Memphis Housing Authority sent demolition crews to Beale Street with federal funding and a list of buildings to flatten. The legal authority for the demolitions came from Title I of the Federal Housing Act of 1949. The act allowed local housing authorities to designate distressed urban districts as so-called slum clearance zones, condemn the buildings within them, demolish those buildings, and resell the cleared land to private developers at a discount funded by federal grants. The original public purpose had been to clear genuinely unsafe tenements. The actual practice between 1949 and 1974 was to clear black commercial districts, Italian commercial districts, and Jewish commercial districts in cities across the United States and replace them with highways, civic centers, surface parking, or low-rise public housing. The Memphis Housing Authority designated the Beale Street Commercial District as a Title I urban renewal zone in 1962. The first demolition contracts went out in 1965. The crews moved methodically. They began at the east end of Beale, near Robert Church Park, and worked their way west toward Main Street. They demolished saloons, they demolished boarding houses, they demolished pawn shops, they demolished the Palace Theater, they demolished Pee Wee's Saloon at 127 Beale, where W.C. Handy had written Memphis Blues. They demolished the row of 2- and 3-story Italianate brick blocks that had defined the streetscape since the 1870s and 80s. By 1970, between Main and 2nd Street, only one building had been spared. The Lansky Brothers clothing store on the south side of the street had been allowed to stand because the owner had pleaded the case personally with the housing authority. Every other commercial structure on those 2 blocks was gone. The cleared land sat as a series of empty lots through the 1970s, the early 1980s, and into the late 1980s. The destruction did not stop at Beale Street. Between 1960 and 1980, roughly 625 buildings were demolished across the broader downtown Memphis core under various urban renewal programs. The Hyde Park neighborhood, north of downtown, lost its historic commercial street. The Vance Avenue corridor lost its black middle-class housing stock. The Foot Homes public housing project, built in 1941 to relocate displaced black families from earlier slum clearance, became one of the densest concentrations of poverty in the city. The economic logic of Title I renewal was sold to city councils, including Memphis's, as a self-financing investment. The federal government would pay roughly 2/3 of the demolition cost. The cleared land would be sold to private developers, who would build new commercial structures generating new property tax revenue. The net effect on the city's tax base would, on paper, be positive. The actual outcome in Memphis was different. The cleared land along Beale Street did not attract new development for almost 2 decades. The displaced businesses did not relocate together. The black commercial network that Robert Church had built between 1879 and 1912, that W.C. Handy had recorded between 1909 and 1916, that hundreds of black entrepreneurs had inherited and operated through 3 generations, was scattered. The buildings did not come back. The tax base did not come back. The architectural loss was specific and dense. The Palace Theater, where Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington had played to packed houses in the 1920s and 30s, demolished. The Hippodrome, a 1,500-seat performance hall, demolished. The Beale Street Baptist Church, the oldest black congregation in the city, narrowly saved. The Mansion House. The Solvent Savings Bank, founded by Robert Church Jr. as the first black-owned bank in the South, building demolished. Pee-wee's Saloon. The old Daisy Theater nearly demolished, the front facade preserved with a new building behind it. The architectural ensemble that had made Beale Street a continuous historic streetscape was reduced to a handful of fragments. The story repeats in Memphis and in dozens of other American cities. In Tulsa, the federal urban renewal program demolished what had been left of Greenwood after the 1921 race massacre. In Atlanta, the Sweet Auburn corridor lost most of its commercial buildings to the Interstate 275 right-of-way and to urban renewal demolitions in the 1960s. In St. Louis, the Mill Creek Valley demolition cleared roughly 20,000 black residents from their homes in a single year. In every case, the explanation was the same: distressed property, blighted district, modernization. In every case, the result was the same. A working black commercial district was demolished. The displaced residents were dispersed. The cleared land sat empty for decades. The buildings did not come back. Memphis was not unusual in losing Beale Street. It was unusual in losing Beale Street while still hosting, 4 blocks away, the most important music recording operations in the South. The bulldozers were demolishing the saloons that had birthed the blues at the same moment that the Stax studio on McLemore was producing Soul Man. The two things were happening in the same city in the same week. By 1970, walking east on Beale Street from Maine, you passed empty lots. You passed empty lots. You passed empty lots. Then you reached a Schwab, which still stood. Then you passed more empty lots. Then you reached Church Park. The street that had been the political and cultural center of Black Memphis for 90 years had been demolished by its own city. The buildings were down. The displaced businesses had not returned. The cleared parcels would not see new construction until the 1983 reopening under Performa Entertainment Real Estate. Even then, the buildings that returned were a curated heritage zone, not a continuous historic district. By the time the music industry collapsed and the assassination came, the buildings were already gone. Chapter 6. When a garbage truck took 2 lives. On the 1st of February 1968, 2 Memphis sanitation workers were crushed inside the back of a malfunctioning truck because black laborers were not allowed to shelter in the cab. Their names were Eckel Cole and Robert Walker. They were both 30-something black men with families. They worked for the Memphis Public Works Department under conditions that had not materially changed since the 1930s. They were paid roughly $1.70 per hour. They received no overtime. They received no medical benefits, no pension, and no death benefits. They worked in rain and ice and heat without protective clothing. On the 1st of February, they were riding on the back of a city sanitation truck that had a faulty compactor mechanism. The truck was caught in a heavy thunderstorm. Cole and Walker had no place to shelter. White sanitation workers in Memphis were permitted to ride inside the cab during bad weather. Black workers were not. Cole and Walker took shelter in the back of the truck, in the hopper area where the trash compactor operated. The compactor activated. They were both crushed to death. The city's response was to offer the families 1 month's pay and a $500 burial expense. There was no pension because the men had not been enrolled in one. There was no widow's benefit because the workers had not been entitled to one. There was no death benefit because the workers had not been classified as full city employees, only as temporary laborers, even though both men had worked for the Public Works Department for years. On the 12th of February, 1,300 Memphis sanitation workers walked off the job. Their demand was simple: recognition of their union, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Local 1733, a small wage increase, time and a half for overtime, the same shelter rights as white workers. The mayor of Memphis at the time was Henry Loeb III, a wealthy white businessman from one of the city's old commercial families. Loeb refused to recognize the union. He refused to negotiate. He insisted that the strike was illegal under Tennessee state law, which forbade public employee unions, and that the workers should return to their jobs while individual grievances were heard. The strike continued. The workers picketed City Hall every day in the rain. The signs they carried, hand-lettered on white cardstock, read simply, "I am a man." The phrase, which had originated in the abolitionist literature of the 1830s, became one of the defining images of the American civil rights movement. Memphis at that moment had a population of just over 600,000. The white commercial class lived in the wealthy neighborhoods east of downtown, in the new suburbs of Germantown and Collierville. The black population, which was around 40% of the city, lived in the older neighborhoods south and north of downtown, and in the public housing projects built since the 1940s. The strike rapidly became a citywide conflict between black labor and white municipal government, and it took place against the backdrop of a downtown commercial district whose Beale Street Commercial Center had just been demolished by the same city government that was now refusing to negotiate over the sanitation workers' wages. In late March, Martin Luther King Jr. came to Memphis to support the strike. He was, at that moment, the most recognized civil rights leader in the United States. He was also exhausted, financially overextended, and under increasing criticism from younger black leaders who believed his commitment to nonviolence had become a liability. The Poor People's Campaign. He was organizing for Washington that summer, required him to stay focused on national logistics. He flew to Memphis anyway. He led a march on the 28th of March that turned violent when a small group of young men at the back of the crowd began breaking shop windows along Main Street. The Memphis police charged the marchers with billy clubs. One 16-year-old boy was shot dead by police gunfire. King was deeply shaken. He returned to Memphis on the 3rd of April, determined to lead a second march that would prove the city's civil rights movement was still capable of disciplined nonviolence. He stayed at the Lorraine Motel at 450 Mulberry Street. The Lorraine had been built in 1925 as the Windsor Hotel, a two-story modernist motor court of stuccoed brick with exterior balconies and a swimming pool in the courtyard. It had been bought in 1945 by Walter Bailey, a black entrepreneur, who renamed it after his wife Laurie. The motel was one of the few hotels in segregated Memphis where black travelers could stay safely. Aretha Franklin had stayed there, Wilson Pickett had stayed there, Sam and Dave had stayed there, Otis Redding had stayed there. The Stax musicians stayed there routinely when they were recording. King was given room 306 on the second-floor balcony, his usual room when he came to Memphis. He arrived after a delayed flight that had been held on the runway in Atlanta because of a bomb threat. That night, he gave the speech at Mason Temple, a few miles south, in which he said that he had been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land. The audience wept. King returned to the Lorraine in the early hours of the 4th of April. He went to bed. The next evening at 6:01 in the evening on the 4th of April, he was shot dead on the balcony outside, room 306, by a single rifle round. Chapter 7. The Balcony That Changed Everything. At 6:01 in the evening on the 4th of April, 1968, a single rifle round traveled across Mulberry Street and ended the American Civil Rights Movement as the country had known it. King had stepped out of room 306 onto the second-floor balcony to call down to the musician Ben Branch, who was waiting in the parking lot. King reportedly said, "Ben, make sure you play Take My Hand. Precious Lord in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty." They were among his last spoken words. The bullet struck him in the face. He was 39 years old. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, less than 2 miles north of the motel. He was pronounced dead at 7:05 in the evening. The shooter was a fugitive named James Earl Ray, who had been hiding in the bathroom of a boarding house across Mulberry Street. The boarding house, run by a woman named Bessie Brewer, had a view directly across to the Lorraine balcony. Ray escaped the boarding house within minutes of the shot, dumped the rifle and a radio in the doorway of an amusement arcade 2 blocks south, and fled the city. He was captured at Heathrow Airport in London 2 months later. In Memphis, the news traveled in minutes. Stax Records was still recording that evening when the call came in. The Stax engineer, Steve Cropper, stopped the tape. The musicians went home. The Beale Street businesses closed. The white-owned department stores downtown closed and locked their doors. The Memphis police were deployed across the city. Mayor Loeb requested federal assistance. The Tennessee National Guard moved into downtown overnight. The riots came in more than 100 American cities, Washington burned along 14th Street. Baltimore burned along North Avenue. Chicago lost 28 square blocks of the West Side. Detroit lost streets it had not finished rebuilding from the riots of 1967. Pittsburgh, Newark, Trenton, Boston, Los Angeles. The death toll across the country reached 43. Federal troops were called out in 8 cities. Memphis itself, in a strange way, did not burn. The civic leadership, perhaps shocked by the location of the murder, perhaps frightened of further escalation, moved quickly. Mayor Loeb settled the sanitation strike on the 16th of April, 12 days after King's death, granting almost everything the workers had demanded. The union was recognized, the wages were raised, the shelter rights were granted, the strikers returned to work. But the deeper damage to the city was not the riot damage, it was the damage to the trajectory. In the year leading up to the assassination, downtown Memphis had been moving toward a kind of integrated commercial revival. Stax was producing world-class records. The Peabody was still operating. The Beale Street demolitions, although devastating, were being framed as the precondition for a new commercial district. The civic elite spoke openly of Memphis as the music capital of the South and the future center of Mid-South finance and trade. After the 4th of April, that vision evaporated. White residents who had been considering staying downtown began moving east. Department stores that had been considering renovations canceled them. The cotton brokers who lived in the Peabody began selling their long-held memberships at the downtown clubs. The Cotton Carnival, which had been the social anchor of the city since 1931, lost its biggest white sponsors. By 1972, the carnival had been reorganized and renamed. The Stax executives talked internally about whether to relocate the studio. They did not. They stayed at 926 East McLemore, but the artists were now harder to recruit. The musicians from out of town were harder to keep. The session players, who had been the daily heartbeat of the studio, began drifting away. Otis Redding's death, 4 months earlier, had been the first cut. The assassination was the second. In Washington, the federal government's response to the assassination accelerated rather than slowed the urban renewal programs that had been demolishing buildings like Beale Street. The Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 passed within weeks of the assassination, expanded federal funding for slum clearance and public housing construction. In Memphis specifically, the funds accelerated the demolition of the few remaining historic commercial structures north of Beale Street that had survived the first round of clearance. The Lorraine Motel itself was emptied of guests for a week, then reopened. Walter Bailey returned to running the front desk. His wife Lori had collapsed during the chaos in the parking lot on the night of the assassination and suffered a stroke. She died several days later. Bailey took down the wreath that he had hung on the balcony of room 306, then he hung up another. The wreath has been there, in some form, ever since. For Memphis, the assassination was not only the loss of a national leader, it was the loss of a building's reputation. The Lorraine, which had been an ordinary working black hotel on Mulberry Street, became, overnight, a site of national mourning and national infamy. Tourists stopped to photograph it. Businesses on the surrounding blocks closed within 5 years. The motel itself began a slow slide into a kind of flophouse operation through the 1970s. A city loses a leader when its leader is killed. A city loses a downtown when the building where the leader was killed is allowed to slowly die. Chapter 8. The decade downtown refused to die quickly. Between 1968 and 1975, the central business district of Memphis lost its hotel, its music industry, its retail anchors, and roughly 100,000 residents. The losses were not simultaneous. They came in a staggered sequence. The population of the central city had peaked at 620,000 in 1960. By the 1970 census, it had declined to 623,000, essentially flat. By 1980, it had fallen to 646,000, but the racial composition had inverted. The white population of the city declined from 310,000 in 1960 to 240,000 in 1980. The black population grew from 180,000 to 307,000. The new white population had moved east, beyond the city limits, into the Shelby County suburbs of Germantown, Collierville, and Bartlett. The economic effect on downtown was immediate. The downtown department stores, Goldsmiths, Lowensteins, Bry's, had been the anchor retailers of the Main Street commercial corridor for more than half a century. Goldsmiths had opened a flagship store on Main Street in 1901. By 1970, it employed roughly 1,500 people. By 1972, the company had announced a new shopping mall location at the Hickory Hill development in East Shelby County. Lowenstein's followed. Bry's closed its downtown store entirely in 1974. The Main Street Pedestrian Mall, opened in 1976 as a desperate civic response to the decline, was supposed to bring downtown shoppers back. It did not. The mall was eventually torn out in 2004, and the street returned to traffic. The Peabody Hotel, the social anchor of the white commercial class for 50 years, slowly emptied. The Skyway broadcasts had ended decades earlier. The ducks still descended to the lobby fountain at 11 every morning, but the lobby was no longer full of cotton brokers. The Cotton Carnival had reorganized. The hotel's corporate accounts had moved to suburban hotels along the Interstate 240 corridor. The Peabody declared bankruptcy in the spring of 1975 and closed its doors. For 5 years, the building stood empty, the lobby fountain dry. The ducks relocated to a temporary pen. The Great Italian Renaissance Revival Tower, an empty shell at the intersection of Union and 2nd. In the same year, the Cotton Exchange building stopped functioning as an active trading floor. The American cotton trade had been moving away from the inland exchanges since the 1960s as international shipping consolidated around containerized ports on the coasts. By 1975, the exchange floor was effectively ceremonial. The building stood, but the trade had gone. The hardwood industry left along with cotton. The Memphis sawmills, which had processed roughly 1 billion board feet per year at their peak in the 1920s, had been declining since the 1940s as the Mid-South hardwood forests were cut over. By 1975, most of the major sawmill operations had closed or relocated. The American Hardwood Lumbermen's Association moved its headquarters out of the city. The river shipping trade, which had been the founding economic engine of Memphis going back to the 1840s, continued to operate. The port of Memphis remained one of the larger inland ports on the Mississippi. But containerization had moved most international trade to the coastal ports of New Orleans, Houston, and Mobile. The Memphis port handled bulk commodities, grain and gravel, not the value-added cargo that had funded the downtown skyline. The deindustrialization was paired with a fiscal collapse. The Memphis tax base had been concentrated in the central business district. The downtown department stores, the Peabody, the Cotton Exchange, the Goldsmiths wholesale operation, the railroad freight terminals, the printing plants, all had paid significant property taxes. As they closed or relocated, the tax base shifted to the suburbs, but the suburbs were outside the city limits. Shelby County collected the taxes. Memphis did not. The city's tax base per capita declined for a decade. The cumulative effect was a downtown that no longer functioned as a downtown. The office workers had moved east to office parks along Poplar Avenue. The shoppers had moved east to the Hickory Hill Mall, and later the Mall of Memphis at Perkins and Interstate 240. The conventioneers had moved to suburban hotels. The cotton brokers had moved to commodity trading desks in Memphis offices that had no need for a physical exchange floor. The musicians had moved away. The recording studios had closed. The buildings remained. The Peabody stood empty. The Cotton Exchange stood empty. The Stax building stood empty. The Lorraine Motel stood mostly empty. The Beale Street lot stood empty. The downtown Main Street, the old retail spine of the city, stood empty. A new vocabulary entered the city's civic conversation. Urban renewal, slum clearance, blight removal, pedestrian malls, mixed-use redevelopment. The phrases were technocratic. The effect was theatrical. The city demolished, then rebuilt at a smaller scale, then watched the rebuilt structures struggle to attract tenants, then demolished again. The crime statistics began to climb during this period, although the climb was slow at first, and the citywide rates were comparable to other southern cities. The visible signs were the boarded windows, the vacant parcels, the homeless populations on the demolished Beale Street lots, the abandoned cars, the small fires. The story of Memphis from 1968 to 1975 is not the story of a sudden collapse. It is the story of a downtown that refused to die quickly. The buildings were too large to demolish all at once. The economy was too diversified to fail in a single sector. The decline ran in slow motion, building by building, year by year, until by the middle of the 1970s, the city had quietly become unrecognizable to anyone who had known it in 1960. By 1975, the music had stopped, the hotel had closed, and the Beale Street demolitions stood unfinished. The next blow came from inside the studio. Yacht, Chapter 9. When a studio sold for $10. In late 1975, Stax Records was forced into involuntary bankruptcy, and Union Planters Bank sold the studio at 926 East McLemore Avenue to a nearby church for the price of a cheap lunch. The collapse of Stax took 8 years to develop and 6 weeks to complete. The first blow had come on the 10th of December, 1967, when Otis Redding's plane went down in Lake Monona in Wisconsin. Redding had been the label's biggest star, the artist whose sales had funded much of the label's expansion. His new single, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, recorded 3 days before the crash, was released posthumously in January 1968 and became the first record by a black artist to top the Billboard Hot 100 after the artist's death. The label sold roughly 4 million copies. None of those sales could replace what had been lost on the ice in Wisconsin. The second blow came in May 1968, 4 weeks after the King assassination. The distribution agreement between Stax and Atlantic Records, signed in 1961, contained a clause Jim Stewart had never noticed. The clause assigned all master recordings produced under the agreement to Atlantic, not to Stax. When Atlantic was sold to Warner Brothers in 1967 and the distribution arrangement came up for review, Atlantic's executives invoked the clause. They took the masters. Stax was left with no back catalog. The label that had recorded Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Booker T and the MGs, Eddie Floyd, and dozens of other artists between 1961 and 1967, no longer owned a single one of those recordings. The third blow came in 1972, when the label signed a new distribution agreement with Columbia Records. The Columbia deal looked generous on paper. Columbia would distribute Stax Records through its national network, pay in advance against royalties, and provide promotional support. The fine print included a clause requiring Stax to deliver a fixed number of records per quarter, with penalties for shortfalls. The clause turned out to be unworkable. Stax did not have the production capacity to meet the quotas. Columbia began charging back unrecouped advances against future royalties. The relationship turned acrimonious within 18 months. The fourth blow came from the bank. Union Planters National Bank, headquartered in downtown Memphis, had been Stax's principal lender since the mid-1960s. As the Columbia distribution disputes grew, and as Stax's cash flow tightened, Union Planters began calling in loans. The label's executives, including the new president Al Bell, who had taken over operational leadership from Jim Stewart in 1969, scrambled to refinance. The bank refused. In December 1975, the label was forced into involuntary bankruptcy. The bankruptcy auction was held in early 1976. The studio building at 926 East McLemore Avenue was sold by Union Planters Bank to the Southside Church of God in Christ, located nearby on McLemore. The reported sale price was $10. The price was symbolic. The bank wanted the building off its books. The church accepted it on the condition that it could be used as a place of worship. The studio equipment was sold separately and dispersed. The Stax marquee, the tall black letters on the yellow ground that had been one of the most photographed signs in American music, was taken down. The building stood, dark, through the rest of the 1970s. Several preservation campaigns attempted to save the building during the 1980s. Local musicians, including Booker T. Jones and Steve Cropper, signed letters to the city. National musicians, including Bob Dylan and Tom Waits, lent support. The funds never materialized. The church could not afford to maintain the structure. The roof began to leak. The walls began to buckle. The sloping floor of the old Capitol Theater, the architectural feature that had given the Stax sound its character, sat for years under standing water. In 1989, the building was demolished. The site became a parking lot. For roughly 15 years, a chain-link fence stood around an empty rectangle of cracked concrete on East McLemore Avenue. Tourists driving slowly down the street from the Civil Rights Museum looked for the building and did not find it. Children from the surrounding South Memphis neighborhoods played on the lot. The address that had produced some of the most important American music of the 20th century was a place to leave a car. In 2003, the Stax Museum of American Soul Music opened on the original site. The building is a careful reconstruction of the Capitol Theater exterior, including a replica marquee and the sloping floor of the original studio. The reconstruction is moving, accurate to the original facade, and useful as a museum. It is not the original building. The architectural artifact that produced the Stax sound, with its irreplaceable acoustic character, is gone. The story of Stax is the story of a label that the Federal Urban Renewal program did not demolish, that the assassination did not directly kill, that white flight did not empty, and that even the bankruptcy did not destroy. The label was destroyed by a sequence of contractual decisions made by men in office buildings in New York and in downtown Memphis. The destruction of the building came afterward, slowly, through neglect. The empty lot on McLemore Avenue, between 1989 and 2003, was the closest thing the city had to a confession. Chapter 10. The Buildings That Money Brought Back. The Peabody Hotel reopened in 1981 because the Bells family spent $25 million to undo what the previous decade had done. Jack Bells was the patriarch of a Memphis real estate family that had built much of its wealth in the post-war suburban expansion. When the Peabody declared bankruptcy in 1975 and the building was put on the market, Bells bought it at the foreclosure auction for a price well below its construction cost. He spent the next 6 years renovating the structure. The renovation budget, which began at roughly $5 million, climbed to $25 million before the work was complete. The Italian travertine fountain was restored. The Skyway Ballroom was restored. The mahogany lobby paneling was restored. The Duck Palace on the roof was renovated, and the ducks themselves were trained anew on a younger generation of Peabody mallards. The Peabody reopened with a ceremony in September 1981. The ducks descended to the fountain at 11 in the morning, as they had since 1933. The ceremony was, in retrospect, the visible beginning of downtown Memphis's slow recovery. The hotel's reopening drew conventions back to the central business district. The streets around Union and 2nd filled with restaurant tables on weekends. The historian David Cohn's 1935 line about the Mississippi Delta beginning in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel was quoted in every magazine profile of the renovation. 6 years later, in 1987, Sun Studio reopened. An entrepreneur named Gary Hardy bought the building at 706 Union Avenue, which had been used variously as a barber shop, a transmission repair garage, and a diving equipment supply store in the intervening decades. The acoustic tile that Sam Phillips had installed on the ceiling in 1950 was still in place. The control booth was where Phillips had built it. The live room was where Phillips had recorded Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, and Roy Orbison. Hardy reopened the building as a working recording studio and a tourist attraction. U2 recorded part of the album Rattle and Hum at Sun Studio in 1987. Bonnie Raitt recorded there. Def Leppard recorded there. Ringo Starr recorded there. The building was designated a National Historic Landmark on the 27th of July, 2003. Sam Phillips died the next day. The third of the recovered buildings was the Lorraine Motel itself. By the early 1980s, the motel had declined into a kind of flop house, with weekly rentals and a chronic crime problem. In 1982, the property went into foreclosure. A non-profit foundation, the Save the Lorraine Foundation, organized to bid on the building at auction. The winning bid was $144,000. The foundation transferred the building to the state of Tennessee. A long restoration followed. The motel's two-story balcony was preserved exactly as it had been on the night of the 4th of April, 1968. The room 306 was preserved as it had been on that morning. The bathroom in the boarding house across Mulberry Street, from which James Earl Ray had fired the shot, was preserved as it had been on that evening. The wreath was rehung on the balcony railing. The National Civil Rights Museum opened in the converted Lorraine Motel on the 28th of September, 1991. It tells the story of the American civil rights movement from the 17th century slave trade through the present. The Lorraine itself is the museum's final exhibit. The room 306 is preserved behind glass. 3 buildings survived: the Peabody, the Sun Studio, the Lorraine. 3 because of 3 separate decisions by 3 separate parties. The Bells family paid $25 million and turned the Peabody back into a working hotel. Gary Hardy paid an undisclosed sum and turned Sun Studio back into a working studio. The Save the Lorraine Foundation paid $144,000 at a foreclosure auction and turned the Lorraine into a national museum. The Stax building did not survive. The Palace Theater did not survive. The Daisy Theater survives as a facade. The Solvent Savings Bank does not survive. Pee Wee's Saloon does not survive. The Hippodrome does not survive. The Beale Street Commercial District as a continuous historic streetscape does not survive. The lesson of Memphis between 1975 and 2003 is that the buildings that survived because someone with money or stubbornness chose to save them, not because the city had a policy of preservation. The same federal funding mechanisms that demolished Beale Street remained in place through the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s. The only thing that changed was the willingness of private investors to bet against the policy. For every building that was saved, 3 or 4 around it had already been lost. The recovery was real. It was also partial. The new Memphis that emerged in the 1980s and 90s was a city of preserved landmarks set inside a downtown of empty lots, surface parking, and one-story commercial structures that the federal Renewal program had not anticipated and the private market had not produced. Chapter 11. The most dangerous city in America. In 2024, the Federal Bureau of Investigation recorded 2,501 violent crimes per 100,000 Memphis residents, the highest rate in the United States. The number is not abstract. It means that, statistically, 1 in every 40 Memphians was the victim of an aggravated assault, robbery, rape, or homicide during that single year. The homicide total for 2023, the year before, had reached approximately 397, a rate of roughly 51 per 100,000, the highest annual total in the city's recorded history. The 2024 numbers improved modestly. The early 2025 numbers improved further. The Memphis Police Department reported in the fall of 2025 that overall crime had reached a 25-year low across nearly every category. Homicide fell roughly 24% in the first half of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024. The improvements are real. The underlying ranking is also real. Memphis at the end of 2024 still held the highest violent crime rate of any American city of more than 100,000 residents. The improvement of 2025 did not move the city out of the top 5. The geography of Memphis crime is not random. The highest concentrations of violent crime occur in the same neighborhoods that lost their commercial buildings to urban renewal between 1960 and 1980. The South Memphis neighborhood that surrounded the Stax studio. The North Memphis neighborhoods that lost their commercial spines to Title I demolitions. The Fraser neighborhood north of downtown that absorbed displaced residents from cleared parcels. The Whitehaven neighborhood south of downtown, that white flight emptied in the 1970s. The crime maps and the demolition maps overlap almost exactly. The economic explanation is straightforward and well documented. Concentrated poverty, generational unemployment, low rates of home ownership, declining school enrollment, and the cumulative effect of disinvestment in the central business district between 1968 and 1975. The Memphis median household income at the end of 2024 was approximately $50,000, well below the national figure. The poverty rate was roughly 25%, twice the national figure. The vacancy rate for commercial real estate in the downtown core was higher than in any comparable southern city. There is also a cultural explanation that some Memphians offer privately. The city, they say, lost its center of gravity in the spring of 1968 and never replaced it. The civic energy that had been concentrated downtown, in the Peabody lobby, in the Cotton Exchange, on Beale Street, dispersed outward to the suburbs and never coalesced again. The downtown that exists today is a heritage tourism zone, a sports arena, a few apartment conversions, and the empty lots that the federal Renewal program left behind. The story of Memphis violence is not, in the data, a story about the absence of policing. The Memphis Police Department has been one of the more aggressive municipal forces in the South for decades. It is not a story about insufficient state intervention. The state of Tennessee has run multiple emergency response programs in the city since the 1990s. It is a story about a city whose physical structure was broken in the 1960s and 70s, and whose neighborhoods have been trying to rebuild on top of that broken structure ever since. The Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics has produced multiple long-range studies of the relationship between urban renewal demolitions and contemporary crime rates in American cities. The findings are consistent. The neighborhoods that lost their commercial buildings to Title I demolitions between 1949 and 1974 show, 50 years later, persistent above-average violent crime rates compared to neighborhoods with similar demographic profiles that retain their commercial buildings. The mechanism is not mysterious. Commercial buildings produced employment, social density, foot traffic, informal supervision, and tax revenue. Their demolition removed those things. The replacement structures, in the cases where any replacement was built, did not restore them. Memphis is, in this sense, an extreme case of a national pattern. The same dynamics that operate in St. Louis, in Cleveland, in Detroit, in Buffalo, in Baltimore, operate in Memphis with the additional weight of the King assassination, the Stax bankruptcy, and the loss of the Beale Street Commercial District. The crime statistics reflect, in 2024, the architectural choices of 1965. The recent improvement matters. The current police department's reductions across nearly every category from 2023 to 2025 represent real and measurable progress. The city is not, in any meaningful sense, ungovernable. But the structural condition that produced the crime statistics in the first place, the broken downtown, the vacant lots, the dispersed tax base, the missing commercial buildings, has not been substantially repaired. It cannot be repaired by policing alone. It requires the rebuilding of physical structures, which requires capital that has not yet flowed into Memphis in the volume required. The most dangerous city in America is, in many respects, the most demolished city in America. The two facts are not separate. Chapter 12. The Empty Lot Where the Music Was Born. The most photographed building in American music history, the Stax Studio at 926 East McLemore, is a parking lot with a partial reconstruction beside it. It is possible to walk Beale Street today and not understand what is missing. The reopened entertainment zone between 2nd and 4th Street is busy on weekends. The neon glows. The clubs play live blues into the night. A Schwab is still selling dry goods. The old Daisy and the new Daisy are open. The wreath on the Lorraine balcony hangs in its place. The ducks of the Peabody descend daily at 11 in the morning to the lobby fountain. The acoustic tile that Sam Phillips installed in 1950 is still on the ceiling at 706 Union Avenue. The visitor who arrives by air takes a cab to a downtown hotel and walks the Heritage Corridor's leaves with the impression that the music capital has been preserved. The visitor who walks east along Beale, past the entertainment zone, finds something else: empty parcels of cleared land, surface parking lots covering blocks that once held 2- and 3-story Italianate commercial buildings. The Lansky Brothers structure stands alone in its block. The Solvent Savings Bank does not stand. The Palace Theater does not stand. The Hippodrome does not stand. Pee Wee's Saloon does not stand. The wood frame boarding houses do not stand. The barber shops, the pawn shops, the pool halls, the gambling parlors, the political offices, the small print shops, the black-owned restaurants do not stand. They are not closed. They are gone. The visitor who drives south to McLemore Avenue and stops at the corner of 926 finds a museum and an empty rectangle of asphalt where the original Stax building stood. The museum is good. It contains an accurate reconstruction of the Capitol Theater marquee, a working performance space, archival recordings, and a careful exhibit of the integrated history of the label between 1957 and 1975. It does not contain the building that produced the Stax sound. That building was demolished in 1989 after 20 years of neglect. The sloping floor of the old Capitol Theater, The architectural artifact that gave the records their irreplaceable mid-range warmth is gone. The visitor who drives north from McLemore to the Lorraine Motel finds the National Civil Rights Museum. Room 306 is preserved behind glass. The bathroom in the boarding house across Mulberry Street is preserved as it was. The exhibits trace the American civil rights movement from the 17th century slave trade to the present. The Lorraine itself is the museum's final exhibit. The wreath is on the balcony. The visitor who walks 4 blocks north reaches the Peabody Hotel. The lobby is full. The travertine fountain runs. The ducks descend. The Skyway broadcasts are gone, but the Skyway Ballroom hosts weddings and corporate dinners. The hotel is, by every measure, a restored Italian Renaissance revival landmark in operation. These are the buildings that survived. They survived because 3 separate private decisions were made between 1981 and 2003. The Bells family chose to spend $25 million on the Peabody. Gary Hardy chose to spend his own savings on Sun Studio. The Save the Lorraine Foundation chose to bid $144,000 at the foreclosure auction. Each decision was made by an individual or a small group, against the prevailing direction of the city's economy. None of them was the product of federal policy. None was the product of state policy. None was the product of city policy. The buildings that did not survive because no one with enough money chose to save them, or because the people who would have saved them did not have the money, or because the federal Renewal program had already demolished them before the conversation could begin. The deeper lesson of Memphis is the relationship between culture and architecture. The music that came out of this city between 1909 and 1968. The Memphis Blues, Rocket 88, That's All Right. Mama, Green Onions, Soul Man, Try a Little Tenderness, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, The King's Speech at Mason Temple, the entire shape of American popular music after the Second World War, came out of specific buildings on specific streets. The blues came out of saloons on Beale. Rock and roll came out of a single-story shop on Union. Soul came out of a converted movie theater on McLemore. Each sound was inseparable from the room that produced it. When the buildings were demolished, the sounds did not vanish. The records still exist. The recordings can be heard. The museums explain the story. But the city that gave America its sound was left with empty lots where that sound had been recorded. The Memphis violent crime rate of 2024, the highest in the United States at 2,501 per 100,000 residents, is the long tale of an architectural collapse that started in 1965 with the first Beale Street demolitions and ended in 1989 with the Stax demolition. The buildings did not produce the music alone. They produced the economic density and the cultural memory that held a downtown together. When they were removed, the downtown could not hold. What Memphis demonstrates to every American city contemplating the demolition of its own historic commercial districts is a simple proposition. Culture without architecture has nowhere to live. The streets that produced Memphis Blues were demolished by the same city that produced Memphis Blues. The motel where Martin Luther King Jr. died was bought back for $144,000 by people who refused to let the city forget. The studio where Otis Redding recorded Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay was sold by a bank for $10 and then demolished. The hotel where the Mississippi Delta began was saved by $25 million from one family. The city that taught America its sound was left with the empty lots where that sound had been recorded. Walk those lots between 2nd and 4th Street on Beale, between Mulberry and Main, between McLemore and South Parkway, and listen. The music is in the recordings. The streets are quiet. The buildings are mostly gone. What this story illuminates is not a moral judgment on Memphis, but a warning about what every city stands to lose when it chooses to demolish rather than to preserve. The wealth and the music came from people working inside specific rooms in specific buildings on specific streets. Those rooms can be replaced with new construction, but the replacement is never the same. The acoustic tile, the sloping floor, the cigar counter at Pee Wee's, the balcony of the Lorraine, are not interchangeable with whatever stands on the same parcel afterward. A century from now, the Peabody will still descend ducks to a lobby fountain. Sun Studio will still record the next generation of restless musicians who have driven down from somewhere upriver. The Lorraine will still hold a wreath on the railing of room 306. The empty lots on Beale Street will probably have been built on by then. The Stax site will still be a museum, beside an empty rectangle of asphalt where the original building stood. The story of Memphis is the story of what a city loses when it loses its buildings. It is a warning written in cleared land. The music capital of America did not become a murder capital because of any failure of its people. It became one because the city demolished the buildings that had held its people together, and the streets that replaced them were never finished. The empty lot where the music was born is still there. So is the music,